Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Eric Davidson and Charles Brook from Spark Climate Solutions to discuss nitrogen, the growing climate impact of nitrous oxide, and innovative ideas on reducing our dependency on synthetic nitrogen fertiliser.
Nitrous oxide is about 270 or so times more potent than is CO2 on what we call a 100-year time scale, 100-year global warming potential.
Nitrous oxide, or N2O levels, continue to rise.
The rate at which it is accumulating in the atmosphere is still going up. We may be kind of leveling off somewhat in some of our emissions of CO2, but there doesn't seem to be any leveling off of N2O.
Historically, the nitrogen cycle was balanced.
If we go back to agriculture before Haber-Bosch, in most cultures throughout the world, they had a pretty circular agricultural system. They had, where they were growing plants, they also had some farm animals, and the farm animals defecated in the croplands. And even the human waste was collected in some cultures and put back onto the croplands. And so that agricultural system was circular.
Currently, nitrogen fertilisation practices are very wasteful. This inefficiency is an opportunity.
Putting fertilizer on the ground, we lose about half. And at that point, you take that crop, the crops, and give it into animals. You might lose an extra, an extra 20% to 30% of that, and then the conversion of that animal protein to humans, you're going to lose an additional maybe 10% or more. At the end of the line, the nitrogen that is fixed, whether from synthetic process or otherwise, that's in that original plant, to the nitrogen that gets in the human can be as low as about 12%.
Wasting nitrogen fertiliser makes economic sense as farmer risk-reward relationships drive behaviour.
And the farmer wants to make sure that he or she gets the best possible crop yield, especially in those years when weather cooperates and you have good weather, and you don't want to lose out on your bumper crop just because you didn't put on enough fertilizer. So the tendency is to take the recommendation from, your crop advisor or the ag extension agent from your state university, and maybe add on another 10% or so just for good measure, because it's not cheap, but it's not all that expensive compared to what they could earn with that bumper crop.
Alternative strategies exist that can be implemented now.
Nitrogen 2.0 would be much more circular and targeted and much more efficient. And there are really three components of it. One is that there are opportunities to feed nitrogen more directly to the livestock. Second, if you can do that, now we can grow corn and other crops that don't need to have as much nitrogen in them to feed the animals because they're getting this nitrogen from other sources. And then finally, there should be much more effort put into recycling manure from our livestock back into the cropland system.
It's the unexpected consequences of our current food systems that need addressing.
We have a very productive agricultural system that has been a boon to human health, and we're not trying to undermine that, but we recognize that it has come with a lot of unintended consequences on its environmental impacts. And so the day has come that we need to recognize those and figure out how we're going to reimagine this system so that we can continue that high productivity of producing food that's nourishing, abundant, affordable, but without all of those environmental impacts.
Eric, Charles, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Delighted to be here.
Absolute pleasure, Ash.
So nitrous oxide, it's a very potent greenhouse gas. It lasts a long time in the atmosphere. It's more potent than carbon dioxide, much more potent than carbon dioxide, and even much more potent than or greater warming potential than methane. Could you please tell us more about nitrous oxide, where it comes from, what it does, how it reacts in the atmosphere, how it's gotten rid of in the atmosphere, please?
Sure. So nitrous oxide comes from both natural processes and human-made processes. So nitrous oxide is produced by bacteria that live in the soil and live in the ocean. It's part of the nitrogen cycle, so that as nitrogen is transformed from one form to another and used by plants and animals and microbes, a little bit of it gets formed into this gas that we call nitrous oxide. Pre-industrial times, back when humans didn't have such a huge impact, the rate at which nitrous oxide was produced in soils and in the ocean by these microbes was roughly equivalent to the rate at which nitrous oxide was destroyed in the atmosphere through photochemical reactions that occur mostly very high up in the atmosphere in what we call the stratosphere. And so for most of geological time, the sources, these microbes in the soils and oceans, were roughly equivalent to the sinks, which is chemical processes in the atmosphere. And so nitrous oxide was relatively stable. Of course, I mean, it changed over different eons, but it was relatively stable. But then come along human beings, and especially when human beings started to multiply more and more, like let's say with the Industrial Revolution, and our population exceeded 1 billion and kept growing, we needed to produce more and more food. And in order to produce more food, you need to bring nutrients into farmland. And that kind of stimulates those microbes that live in the soil. And so they start producing more and more N2O. And so you can pretty much track human numbers with the amount of N2O increasing in the atmosphere, because we're now producing it at a rate higher than it is destroyed in the stratosphere. And so it accumulates in the atmosphere because we're producing it as a byproduct of producing our food.
And what's the relative warming potential or capacity of nitrous oxide compared to more commonly discussed greenhouse gases?
So on a mass basis, if you compare CO2 and nitrous oxide is about 270 or so times more potent than is CO2 on what we call a 100-year time scale, 100-year global warming potential. So it's very much more potent than CO2.
And in terms of the time it takes to break down in the atmosphere, and also, is there anything we can share in how low are the nitrous oxide levels and how fast or how much have they risen over the last 50 or 100 years?
Right. So pre-industrial times, the concentration in the atmosphere was about 270 parts per billion. That's a billion is in B as in boy. And now it's up around between 330 and 340. So it's increased by about 25%. So in terms of a percent increase, it's sort of comparable to CO2. One of the differences, however, is that the rate at which it is accumulating in the atmosphere is still going up. We may be kind of leveling off somewhat in some of our emissions of CO2, but there doesn't seem to be any leveling off of N2O. So it's just going up sort of in an exponential fashion. And that's related to the fact that we're trying to produce more food to feed more people very nutritious diets.
So onto the food side of things, where because many people who be listening probably don't know a lot about nitrous oxide, and some may not know anything at all. So where does it come? What's the modern sources? Where's that come from, and how's that getting out into the atmosphere? Can we just talk about through that whole process?
Sure. So there are multiple sources. As I said, that there are natural sources in forest soils, in the ocean, in lakes, and so on. Um, and as I said, there it's bacteria, microorganisms that live in those soils and those waters. And the majority, about two-thirds of the anthropogenic or man-made sources, are from agriculture, from mostly from us using fertilizers and manures to enrich the soil in nitrogen and other nutrients. And that just sort of stimulates those microbes that would be in that soil anyway to produce more nitrous oxide. Now, the other third comes from a variety of different things, like our wastewater treatment in the process of treating sewage or not treating sewage. There is there are again bacteria that produce nitrous oxide. There's also some that's produced from burning fossil fuels, burning biomass. All those, the fuel that's used contains a little bit of nitrogen, and when it gets combusted, that produces a little bit of nitrous oxide. And then finally, there are a couple of industrial processes, mainly the production of nitric acid, which is used to make fertilizers and also to make munitions, and the production of adipic acid, which is used to make nylon. And those industrial processes also produce inadvertently N2O as a byproduct. But all those others kind of add up to the other one third. The big, 500-pound cow or pig or whatever in the room is food, is agriculture in terms of nitrous oxide production.
So is it correct in terms of that whole time scale as humans went from pre-industrial revolution through the industrial revolution to today, that when the use of manure started to increase, was that 400 500 years ago, there was a gradual increase in nitrous oxide, and then it basically got a huge boost as soon as more industrial inorganic nitrogen compounds started to be produced and used, and as more land was fertilized with more of these inorganic compounds, it's just accelerated the amount of nitrous oxide that's been added to the atmosphere.
Right, that's spot on. So the industrial process for producing synthetic fertilizers actually began right around World War I, where it was produced not for fertilizers, it was done to make munitions. In Germany, they were worried about not being able to get nitrates from natural sources of nitrate in Chile because they thought that the British Navy would control the seas, and so they needed to develop their own source of oxidized forms of nitrogen for their munitions. And so the Germans developed a synthetic process to fix nitrogen into these forms. It wasn't until after World War II that it actually became used in a big way for fertilizers. And ever since then, the use of fertilizers has pretty much skyrocketed.
And this is the Haber-Bosch process.
Yes, Haber-Bosch, yes.
So I guess the other side of this is why is nitrogen so important? And obviously that goes back to it's such an important fertilizer in accelerating crop growth and the yields that farmers get across their production systems would not be possible without the amount of nitrogen that's used. So do you want to just talk to us a bit more about nitrogen, its role in plant growth, and why it's so vital to have our current food system that's needed to feed the 8 billion of us today?
Right. So nitrogen is absolutely essential for all forms of life. plants and animals and microbes. It is the basis for making amino acids, and amino acids are the basis for making proteins, and they're the basis for making enzymes that regulate everything we do, digesting our food, growing muscles, growing our hair, our fingernails, I mean, everything. And also all the enzymes that plants use to photosynthesize, to, make energy, to make biomass. That all depends on these proteins and these enzymes that contain nitrogen as an essential ingredient. And so life simply wouldn't exist if we didn't, if this form of nitrogen didn't exist. Now, our atmosphere is made up about 80% of nitrogen gas, which we can't use. We breathe it into our lungs and breathe it back out unchanged because we can't use it. But there's a certain microorganisms that can take that nitrogen out of the air and put it into organic forms that we can use, that we can consume, and that plants can consume. And so, that is what we call the nitrogen cycle of that there are forms of nitrogen that life forms can use, and that it's essential for our use, for our existence.
My understanding, and please add to this, is that in, I guess, pre-human civilization, so in natural environments, there was, as you mentioned, bacteria in the soil or attached to plants or etc. that converted the inorganic nitrogen into something, the N2 into something that animals and plants could use. There was also lightning strikes is also another source of nitrogen that as the lightning passed through the atmosphere, that 80% of nitrogen, some of it was turned into a soluble form, which was then washed down with the rain and provided nitrogen to plants. And then once it was in the soil and in the plants, then they would grow and decay and re-release it into the soil. And then animals would eat various plants and then transport it and move it around. And as they either died, were eaten, or defecated and urinated, that would also spread nitrogen around. Is that a basic understanding of the natural nitrogen cycle?
Yep, I think you've got it spot on. The lightning produces a relatively small amount relative to the bacterial fixation of nitrogen in the modern world. Now, if you go back way back in before life, probably the main source of reactive nitrogen was from lightning, and perhaps some other processes as well. But eventually, life evolved, and this mechanism to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere evolved with it. And so that's the biggest show now. And now humans have figured out a way to do it synthetically as well. And so we're changing the whole process.
But one of the things about the natural system was that it was a very circular system. It was created and then it was reused by a plant, then an animal, and then insects and birds, and then back to plants. And is very much a circular process. And can you talk us through what happened especially once the Haber-Bosch process came into being, how that system was changed?
Right. And so if we go back to agriculture before Haber-Bosch, in most cultures throughout the world, they had a pretty circular agricultural system. They had, where they were growing plants, they also had some farm animals, and the farm animals defecated in the croplands. I mean, and even the human waste was collected in some cultures and put back onto the croplands. And so that agricultural system was circular. It wasn't very productive. I mean, they didn't produce, they didn't have very good crop yields, tiny fractions compared to today, but there weren't as many people to feed. It's more, as the population grew, partly because food became somewhat more available, but in general, as the population grew and there was greater food demand, there was a need to import more nitrogen into the farmland rather than simply recirculating what was already there. And so now we have a system that is, what we were describing before with pre-industrial revolution, we call nitrogen 0.0. And then post Haber-Bosch, we call that nitrogen 1.0. And it was still is a very linear, non-circular, leaky, rather inefficient system. It produces a heck of a lot of food and some pretty nutritious food, and humans are now better nourished than any time in human history. So I'm not trying to say it's all bad. Actually, it's been a boon for human health. There's still people who don't have enough to eat, but that's mostly due to war or natural disaster. And we actually produce enough food that if we distributed it equitably, everyone on Earth would have enough to eat and they would have a nourishing diet. So in that sense, nitrogen 1.0 has been very successful. But as I said, it's very linear and very leaky. You put fertilizer on the soil, you grow plants. Most of those crops are then fed to our livestock. Only a small fraction is actually eaten directly by humans in plant-based diets. Most of it's fed to livestock. The livestock only convert a small fraction of the nitrogen. Most of it goes to their feces and urine, as you pointed out before. And our livestock system has now been separated from our crop production system. So the livestock, there's still obviously there's still extensive grazing and pasture lands, but there's a lot of livestock that are grown in what we call CAFOs, that are confined systems where the animals are kept. And it's generally not economical or even sometimes not even feasible to take that manure and put it back onto the croplands because it's too wet, it's too heavy, it's too far away from the cropland. And so, these nutrients are just going through this system very linearly and not being recirculated back. And that contributes to the leakage of this nitrogen in various ways into waterways, into groundwater, into lakes, rivers, estuaries that cause algal blooms, and also in gaseous forms such as ammonia and nitrous oxide, which then have impacts on air quality and on climate. One thing I should mention about nitrous oxide, in addition to being a very potent greenhouse gas, is that it is responsible for destroying stratospheric ozone that protect the up in the high level of the atmosphere, high altitude. The ozone layer there is protective of us of radiation. And nitrous oxide is one of the substances that destroys stratospheric ozone. So it's kind of a double whammy in terms of its impact on both climate and on stratospheric ozone.
And back to the ozone and that side of things, the Montreal Agreement that was initiated globally to stop the depletion of ozone is actually the most successful climate agreement that's ever been implemented, and that's been hugely successful. So anything we can do to replicate that success is a wonderful thing. In terms of how leaky it is, so how much and you might be able to add some of this, Charles, as well, how much of the nitrogen fertilizer that's put onto crops is actually used by the crops, and then how much of that is then ends up in either animals, and can we go through and quantify some of those leaks?
Yeah, sure. So in general, and I'll put it kind of a broad strokes here, there's definitely variability in the efficiencies of different systems throughout the path. But on the face of it, putting fertilizer on the ground, we lose about half. And at that point, you take that crop, those crops, and give it into animals, you might lose an extra an extra 20% to 30% of that, and then the conversion of that animal protein to humans, you're going to lose an additional maybe 10% or more. At the end of the line, the nitrogen that is fixed, whether from synthetic process or otherwise, that's in that original plant, to the nitrogen that gets in the human can be as low as about 12%. And that's really concerning because we find that 50 to 60% of all the nitrogen in our bodies, in humans, actually comes from Haber-Bosch processes. And so the overall efficiency of the system from fixing, a very energy expensive process to fix nitrogen, apply that through this system and only receive a small fraction of that really, really is concerning throughout the whole process.
So if we can just go through some of those numbers, you said 50 to 60% was lost before it was taken up by the plant. Then there was another lot that was lost. I can't remember the exact numbers when it got to the animal, and it got to the fact that only roughly 12% or something actually got into humans. And where did that nitrogen end up? Because my understanding is of the nitrogen that was lost to the plant, a lot of that ends up in the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. But some will also end up in subsoil, aquifers, some will end up in rivers. And then likewise, the nitrogen that's comes through the animal, the feces and the urine. Is that staying in the soil for later use? Is it end up in a CAFO? Is it end up in our waterways? So can we just sort of work through where that nitrogen is going?
Well, actually, the nitrous oxide is a fairly small percentage. It's probably only about 1 or 2%. But it's, I make it to an analogy of alcohol in your blood. You don't need a very high percentage to have an impact. And so, and that's one of the problems actually in terms of talking to farmers about mitigating nitrous oxide. They can afford to lose 1 or 2%. They don't care that much about that in terms of their bottom line. The bigger losses actually are leaching of nitrate into groundwater and surface waters, which ends up causing harmful algal blooms or nuisance algal blooms and so-called dead zones or hypoxia zones with low oxygen in estuaries and coastal regions. In terms of mass balance, in terms of quantity, nitrate is probably the bigger loss, with the exception when we get into livestock, and maybe Charles would talk about this in terms of ammonia emissions. That's also a pretty big number in terms of ammonia losses, particularly from manure during its management and handling, is pretty significant as well.
Just the other thing to add here, if 50% of the fertilizer is lost and not actually utilized by the plant, I think one way to think about that is every time you filled up the gas tank and you had a leak and you lost half, the gas in your tank, there's a big cost in that. How much does the US spend on nitrogen fertilizer, average, an average year? And so what's the opportunity cost in terms of losing 50, 60% into 50 or 60% of that?
Well, let's see. I have seen numbers on the global scale of in the order of billions of dollars being lost. I'd have to do the arithmetic really quickly to take the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used in the U.S. times the cost per pound of fertilizer and so forth to come up with that. I could come up with that number fairly quickly, but maybe not off the top of my head. The issue is, more importantly, although it seems it's going to be a really big number, for an individual farmer, still, what the farmer is concerned about is avoiding risk. And I can understand that. I mean, we all want to avoid risks in our lives, right? And the farmer wants to make sure that he or she gets the best possible crop yield, especially in those years when weather cooperates and you have good weather and you don't want to lose out on your bumper crop just because you didn't put on enough fertilizer. So the tendency is to take the recommendation from, your crop advisor or the ag extension agent from your state university and maybe add on another 10% or so just for good measure, because it's not cheap, but it's not all that expensive compared to what they could earn with that bumper crop on those years that they get good weather. And so it's kind of like an insurance policy. I'll pay a little more for a little extra nitrogen um, as an insurance policy to make sure that I get the best possible yield. And you can understand why they do that. It's a perfectly rational thing to do. And so what we need to do as a society is figure out, okay, what can we do to help farmers accept the risk if they apply a little bit less fertilizer or maybe a lot less fertilizer. I'm not saying none. I'm saying cutting it back 20% or something like that. And that's an additional risk. Can we share that risk somehow? We have a farm production system, a farm bill that has all kinds of incentive programs and subsidies. So that would not be anything new. What would be new would be to direct those towards uh, reducing the risk of the nitrogen loss to our waterways and to our atmosphere in order to protect us from climate change, from water pollution, air pollution. That's currently not part of the incentive programs to help farmers make the decisions on how they manage their farms and manage nutrient use on the farms.
And while we focus more on the nitrous oxide so far and its impact on global warming, I think, and correct me if I'm not 100% correct on this, there's going to be some significant climate or environmental impacts from the nitrates, etc. Those dead zones, algal blooms are going to decrease issues with biodiversity, the flow of nutrients through those zones because there's no animals or birds or plants or bacteria living them there. And then also if you have water, and our waterways and oceans are one of the, there's more photosynthesis goes on in the oceans and in the waterways than goes on land, from my understanding. So the more dead zones you've got, you're not actually sequestering carbon in those places. So it's all both the nitrates have big implications as well as the nitrous oxide. Is that correct?
Yeah, you've got it just right in that there are lots of co-benefits if we do it right, and there are lots of co-dangers, if whatever the opposite of co-benefits is, if we do it wrong. And so they're interlinked, and that's one of the interesting things about nitrogen is management is it goes across sectors, and it goes across ministries or agencies. It's not only an issue for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's an issue for the Environmental Protection Agency, for the Department of Energy, and on and on and on and on.
And back to the nitrogen, does it react the same way if you put, because you said bacteria is what is going to create the nitrous oxide, and the amount of water will available in the soil or in the environment will determine how fast it moves through soil profiles or washes off into water. So I'm guessing that there's a timing. If you put it onto completely dry soil, something will happen. If you put it onto waterlogged soil, something will happen that will be different, and that can be managed to not decrease crop yields, but increase the utilization and decrease the environmental and climate impact. Is there opportunities that we can dig into there?
Yeah, you're really getting down into the weeds now, and it's part of the devil and the God in the details. In that there are so many ways to manage nutrients and manage nitrogen in a farming context. When they put it on, how much they put it on, how they put it on. Do they inject it deep into the soil or broadcast it on the surface. In the US, in much of the Midwest, it's actually cheaper for them to put the fertilizer on the previous fall, which doesn't really make much sense from the point of view of trying to make efficient use of it, but that's when it's cheapest and most available and easiest to work the field, and they can be sure that they get it on before they plant in the spring. So that's that's an example of a just kind of a crazy practice that doesn't make any sense biologically, but economically it does. And so how we manage the way that the nutrients are used is really important. And again, it's related to a variety of incentives and policies that we make for farmers that result in these impacts.
So what can we do differently to both manage the nitrogen so that more is used by the plant and less is leaked into the environment, and also incentivize farmers to uptake these practices?
Well, let me put it into 2 or 3 categories. First of all, there are a lot of things being done right now, and they're encouraging, and I support them. The fertilizer industry, particularly in the U.S., has adopted something that they call the 4 Rs, which is to put on the right amount of fertilizer, the right time, and the right place. I'm missing one of the R's. uh, anyway, it's
Just on
working.
that, it's uncanny how many times people on the podcast suggest 3 or 4 or whatever things, and they get almost to the end, but they don't quite get to the end. But continue,
It's
please.
okay. Right type, right amount, right place, and right time. I got it that time.
Awesome.
So the and that's good. And they work with extension agents. They work with farmers. There are lots of apps to figure this out. To in extension to advise farmers on how to do this, and we are making incremental progress in that regard. And they're developing fertilizers that are slow release fertilizers, and they're developing some inhibitors for some of these microbial processes so that the fertilizer stays in the soil a little longer, so that there's more time for the crop to take it up. There are a bunch of incremental approaches like that are helping, but they really haven't done enough to really turn the corner in terms of reducing nitrogen losses significantly to either the atmosphere or the waterways. So we still have a growing dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. We still have nitrogen problems in some of the Great Lakes and the Chesapeake Bay. And we still have nitrous oxide accumulating at an accelerating rate in the atmosphere. So it probably would have been a lot worse if we hadn't been making that incremental progress, but it's just not getting us to where we need to go. So a second thing would be to let's focus a little more on the socioeconomic component and what is it that we can do to help farmers make decisions, not only based on, what dad did or what grandpa did, or based on, only the current market forces. How can we manipulate that a little bit to give them more incentives and more information to change some of their practices? So that's something that has been neglected a lot, and I think it needs more attention. And then the third package I'd say is let's think bigger and be more innovative further down the road. And this is what the concept we call nitrogen 2.0. I already talked to you about nitrogen 0.0, which was before Haber-Bosch. Nitrogen 1.0, which is what we're in right now, this very linear, very productive, but leaky system. Nitrogen 2.0 would be much more circular and targeted and much more efficient. And there are really 3 components of it. One is that there are opportunities to to feed nitrogen more directly to the livestock. Right now, they get almost all of their nitrogen from the crops that we feed them. There's some additives, but most of it comes from the crops. There are technologies now to you'd still need feed, you'd still need crops, but you can add amino acids, you can add various forms of nitrogen. There may be some new technologies of, growing microbial biomass to add to the feed. In a sense, you're skipping one of those trophic levels. You're skipping one of those leaky things. You're not relying on it as much on broadcasting nitrogen on the soil, and only half of it gets into the plant, and then even a smaller fraction gets into the animal. You more directly target more of the nitrogen directly to the animal. There's some technological things that need to be worked out and made more economical for that to work. And there's maybe some socioeconomic impediments too, but that would really be a game changer. That's one. Second, if you can do that, now we can grow corn and other crops that don't need to have as much nitrogen in them to feed the animals because they're getting this nitrogen from other sources. And a lot of our corn now goes to biofuel, and it's quite likely there's going to be even more as there's a push for sustainable aviation fuel. The airlines they can't get enough of the stuff that they want to try to decarbonize air traffic or airline travel. There are lots of competing demands on our cropland, but that's one way you could produce biofuels without using as much nitrogen, because you don't need nitrogen to make jet fuel or any other kind of fuel. In fact, it's an extra ingredient that they have to figure out how to take out. And so we could then do crop breeding for different types of crop attributes that use nitrogen much more efficiently. If we aren't so dependent on it for providing a lot of nitrogen to our livestock. And then finally, there should be much more effort put into recycling manure from our livestock back into the cropland system. And there are already a lot of research going on things that we call manure sheds. It's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? But analyzing where are the livestock, where are they producing the manure, what is the transport cost, how can it be managed in such a way to get it back into the cropping system. And there's some challenges there as well, but we really need to make this system more circular and reintegrate the animal and the crop production system. Now, many of your listeners might ask, well, why isn't he talking about changing human diets? Why isn't he talking about people shifting from animal-based diets to plant-based diets? And that's a good idea too. And I've already done that to a large extent myself. I'm not a strict vegetarian, but I eat a whole lot less meat than I used to. But that's a whole different realm, in my opinion, of trying to change people's habits. And what I outlined to you before is not inconsistent with that. If people started eating less animal products, meat and dairy, we could still use all the improved efficiencies that I just talked about, in addition to human dietary change. So what I'm looking for is fundamental changes in our agricultural system that will produce whatever kind of food people are asking for, whether it's plant-based or animal-based, whether it's red meat or white meat. We need agricultural systems that can produce abundant, nutritious, affordable diets that respond to what the consumer is demanding, and we need to be able to do it in a sustainable way.
Awesome. In terms of the recycling of manure, does it really make a big difference whether the animal is grazing and the animal is the one that's spreading that manure over the agricultural land, or if the animal's in a confined system and we use machinery to spread the manure over the land?
Charles, I'll send that one to you.
Yeah, I will say that in natural grazing systems, you're going to have some actual physical disturbance of soil, right? You're going to have animals that weigh 1,000 pounds plus pushing manure deeper into the soil, and that's certainly going to have an impact and an effect. But the reality is our ability to measure on a field scale the impacts of different types of distribution systems really isn't that great. And its overall long-term effects on both soil carbon and effectiveness of nitrogen really is an area that we need to be putting a lot more investment in time and energy into. And we're starting to see an increase in that, trying to understand how we can, if we really look at manure as a resource, and we have great collections of it and great quantities of it in concentrated areas, what's the best way to preserve it and use it? And there's still a lot of work to be done on there. And so, unfortunately, I'd love to be able to tell you, oh, it's better for the cow to do it, or it's better for the tractor to do it. But unfortunately, at this time, we don't really know, to any, I would say, just discernible degree. People are going to have opinions about that, and you might see a paper one way or the other. But we really need to do a better job of understanding what the best way to reuse those nutrients are.
But either way, it's probably better than spreading it mechanically is probably better than it sitting in a big fat pile somewhere where it's not being utilized, or it's slowly washing away into the rivers or leaching into the groundwater.
The other aspect we have to consider is the access to land. Most, usually we think about stocking rates, right? I mean, how many animals do you have, and how much land are you associating with those animals for feed? But the shifting and the concentration of diets and transportation of diets far away from where those animals are decouples the manure from the land that's going to be producing that manure, right? And so while one operation, dairy or feedlot or anything else, may grow a few acres, they may have animals that really need to be able to spread that manure over hundreds of acres. And so you have a mix match in surface area and land available to the amount of manure. And we need to do a better job of looking at how we can open up those lines of transportation to more effectively spread that across, because you have massive concentrations of nutrients that potentially the surrounding land can't absorb.
So that goes back to what Eric said about the nitrogen 1.0, where and I imagine it's the same with other nutrients, where you're putting them onto a piece of land, or the nutrients are in the land, the crop grows, it then goes to an animal, or it goes directly to a person, and then the animal eats it, and then the person eats the animal, or the person eats those nutrients, and then it's released into whatever the sewage system is happened to be there. So at some stage in the future, be it 10 million, 100 million, 500 million years from now, that area in the Gulf of Mexico where all those nutrients have been flowing, geological activities will happen, and there'll be a monumentally fertile piece of land at some stage in the far, far distant future. But obviously we're not going to benefit in the foreseeable future from that. So how do we, I guess, back to that, creating that circularity and being more efficient, those 4Rs that were mentioned, what are the first steps? What's needed? Do we need further research? Do we need schemes or projects to help farmers adopt these new technologies? Do we need to have consumer campaigns to try and create the market signals that these are the right ways of going? What's the next steps in terms of trying to make what we just discussed more broadly implemented and having impact?
I would say first, we need to get on the same page and coordinate a little bit better. We have here in the U.S. we have immense infrastructure for understanding our land and our agricultural systems, but without a bit of a North Star and a coordinated and aligned effort, we find it's very difficult for these things to make progress independently and integrate. So understanding that system, who's involved, who should be involved, and having that research agenda outlined and supported, obviously, a first step. And we've done a bit of that now, and early on, looking at what's possible to make nitrogen 2.0 a reality. Um, but also, as I mentioned previously, measurement is difficult in a lot of these lands. So understanding the modeling and the levers, the pushes and pulls in the system that are going to allow a change to happen, and some of the technological innovation that's going to be necessary to allow it to happen, identified in very intentional programs to overcome those barriers, are going to be needed. And this is not a small project. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the way we produce food. And so I don't want anyone to think this is a 2-year project and then we've got it sorted. But most transformative things, I think, generally are.
Anything do you have to add there, Eric?
Yeah, I'd say in the short term, what I'd like to see is more emphasis put on helping farmers understand the risks associated with using their nutrients more efficiently and perhaps using less. And if they're risk adverse and we need programs to help them share that risk, I think that's where we need to be putting some emphasis in the short term. The current farm bill that's still being negotiated, for example. Nitrogen 2.0, as Charles said, is a much longer range vision, in which there are lots of different pieces, some of them technological development, like making sure it makes sense to try to produce synthetic amino acids to add directly to animal feed. And how can that be done effectively? How can we reintegrate animal and crop production systems within so-called manure sheds? Those are some research questions that are going to take some time. But I agree with Charles that the first step in developing those research agendas is to first have a vision, and second, chart out a roadmap to get to that vision, and what are the things that need to be done in order to get there, both in terms of the technological development and the adoption of those technologies.
There's a lot there, and probably another 2 or 3 potential episodes if we're going to dig into all of this. There's something that comes to mind is just down the road from like half a mile from where we live. There's a few acres of kind of grassland, meadowland, and rather than cutting that with a lawnmower of some sorts all the time, a herd of goats comes once a year and spends about 2 weeks with electric fences kind of grazing that area. And obviously from the global climate's perspective, one herd of goats chewing down one meadow that's 5 acres or 10 acres is not going to do anything. But it's that whole concept of bringing animals in, recirculating those nutrients, not burning fossil fuels to manage landscapes, but the other side of things, it's a much more logistically and managerially difficult to bring in 100 goats than for someone to jump on a lawnmower and drive up and down and cut that grass. So I guess there's some thinking in terms of not necessarily just doing something that's simple because we're just looking at one step down the track, but we need to embrace some complexity here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Go ahead, Charles.
I would agree, and I would also. I mean, at this time, it's funny you bring up the goats. There's actually right now the goats are moving at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They have a famous goat herd that comes in and mows down because it's very hilly and very difficult to manage a lot of that land. But it's a significant fire fuel load. And it's a very practical risk mitigation measure that's starting to gather a lot more attention as well. But it's an integrated system, but very intentionally managed. And I think we've also done away with a lot of that, even in our grazing lands, right? That have people often think that these extensive systems in well managed extensive systems are hands off, but the reality is in very well managed extensive systems, it's a lot more work, right? You're actively moving these animals around very intentionally, trying to understand their role, and integrating them with the land. So, yeah.
Yeah, notice that Charles used the word systems several times, and we definitely have to have a systems approach. Farmers are very much systems managers. I mean, a farm is a very complex thing. They have to manage machinery, landscape, workers, maybe animals. So farmers are inherently systems managers, but we need to look at the system beyond the farm gate. We need to look at this farm and that farm and the whole region and how that fits into the country and the globe, and how nutrients come in and come out, food comes out, and think of that as an entire systems perspective. And it's not just nitrous oxide, it's also methane, it's carbon dioxide, it's nitrate leaching, and it's food security. So all those things come together into a grand systems approach. And as opposed to thinking of it as helter-skelter, willy-nilly, let entirely market-driven. Actually, that's a fallacy. It's not entirely market-driven now. We have a very modified market system with all the incentives that are in the Farm Bill, and that's true for just about every country. So let's manage those a little bit more intelligently and do it from a more intelligent systems approach.
So that's then getting farmer groups and communities together with the government, the regulators, and the researchers to try and map out how to incentivize the behaviors that we identify the behaviors we want and then incentivize those behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other the other day we had the State of the Science Summit talking about enteric methane at UC Davis, and I think Undersecretary for USDA Farm Production and Conservation Robert Bonney said something very very good. It's about communication. Oftentimes, it's not about environmental policy being done to farmers. It should be about a conversation where environmental policy is developed with farmers, and because at the end of the day, these practices are on land, and these practices are decisions that are made every day, or several times a day, or several times a year. And so that communication, unfortunately, a lot of times goes by the wayside, and we need to be very intentional about making sure that we have strong communications and communications on you know a playing field where everyone feels comfortable to be on. So I will say that, yeah.
I think that's a great comment, and I think all back to the complexity that all these things we're talking directly about nitrogen, but all these things and the way land is managed, fertilizer regimens and agronomic practices impact soil organic matter and soil structure, which impacts water holding capacity and any carbon sequestration, and that also impacts the biodiversity within those soils, which can have impacts on wildlife, bird life, insect. It just cascades and cascades and cascades and goes on. And we don't have the other side of that is that farmers are the stewards of the 60% of the land mass globally that's devoted to agriculture, and they're the ones who are actually managing that land. Unless we can find a way of trusting these people and working, that's our only mechanism of changing practices, by trusting and building relationships with the people who are actually the stewards of the land, to work with them for better outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, I was so impressed by visiting a farmer in on the eastern shore of Maryland a few weeks ago, who calls himself a regenerative agriculture farmer. He still uses fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides as he needs to. He doesn't use as much pesticide and herbicide as he used to. But what his main approach is, managing his cover crops, the crops that are planted during the dormant season. He has, I don't know, 6 or 8 different species of plants that he mixes together in those cover crops. And he said the day that when he knew he had gotten the right mix and who was doing the right thing was when he was approaching one of his trial fields and he saw lots of birds there. And in the other fields, there were no birds. And, having the birds isn't something that he can put on his financial bottom line. But to him, it was something that was really important, showing that he was able to manage his farm and have competitive yield compared to his neighbors, and do so in a way that he could feel that he was being a steward of the land, and then he saw other benefits of having this more complex mix of cover crops meant that he had less disease of various kinds, and it could end up spending less money on pesticides, not zero, but a lot less. And so there are lots of different ways to kind of move into this as to different people's incentives and why they do things. But ultimately, they tend to point towards a more sustainable and long-range productive system. And by the way, nitrogen 2.0, although we didn't talk about regenerative agriculture, it's entirely consistent with all of the concepts of regenerative agriculture, of reintegrating plant and animal systems, keeping the soil covered with a living crop as much as possible, and so on. And although it is still what you might call intensive agriculture, and some people would pejoratively call it industrial agriculture. And we could argue about those adjectives until the cows come home, but ultimately we have to have systems that produce enough food for 8 to 10 billion people, hopefully without spreading the footprint of agriculture any further than it is already. In fact, it'd be nice if we could recover some conservation lands. And that means we have to have very productive systems, which means we have to have very smart systems. And call it intensive or industrial if you want, but it needs to be very smart. And I don't think those words are inconsistent with being sustainable.
Thank you both very much. We're running out of time. So before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed? Charles, Eric?
Well,
as you said, we've covered a lot. So, not from me.
So I just want to reiterate that we have a very productive agricultural system that has been a boon to human health, and we're not trying to undermine that, but we recognize that it has come with a lot of unintended consequences on its environmental impacts. And so the day has come that we need to recognize those and figure out how we're going to reimagine this system so that we can continue that high productivity of producing food that's nourishing, abundant, affordable, but without all of those environmental impacts. That's really our goal. And so we need all the tools in the toolbox to figure out how to develop these systems more intelligently and to involve farmers all over the world, from different sizes of farms, from smallholders to giant corporate farms, to figure out how we achieve those goals.
Eric, Charles, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a
Ash,
gas.
always a pleasure.
Thanks. Thank you very much. You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Eric Davidson and Charles Brook, recorded in California in July 2024.